This was not something I intended to do. There was originally the speaker scheduled for today was the member of the New York Board of Regents, right? Who knew it was Easter, but didn't realize it was also Passover. Probably didn't also recognize that tomorrow is Earth Day also. So that when he decided he couldn't make it, that's Roger Tillis, when he decided he couldn't make it, there were some questions about whether or not we should invite an outside speaker to come and who would show up on a day like this, and the thought was probably no one will show up, so that maybe we shouldn't have a program on Easter Sunday. And it didn't seem to me a good idea, so I said I'd take responsibility for putting together some program. That was not my intention to speak. But Kelly is not here, as obvious. Alicia is overwhelmed. There were other plans that I had in mind, and it ends up that they didn't work out as I had planned. So I am, and then look at all the people that are here. This is all right. So I guess it was important to have a meeting. I always think it's very important for us to be open every Sunday, regardless of whatever the situation. I even feel that's the case when the snow is out and the ice is out. If any one, two people want to come, I think it's important for us to always be here and be available as a community, sustaining ourselves. But here I am to speak today, and I have interesting things, hopefully, to say. You will determine that. But I will welcome questions and comments. I think it's somewhat more of an informal situation. What I want to talk to you about, as Mel mentioned, is what is an ethical economy. And I want to talk about things that are happening nationally and that we are doing locally, which give expression to the values that sustain the society, and in which we may choose to be more actively involved in different ways over time. That will be for individuals to decide. And what we're talking about is a developing underground campaign, you might say. It certainly is not in the front media, but it is developing all across this country. Right? Ways in which efforts are being undertaken for individuals and communities to take increasing control of their own economic affairs. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk specifically about some of the things that are happening on Long Island and in the state of New York, which are expressions of a certain set of values. And let me put that partially in a little value perspective, right? With a few quotes about the relevant difference between competition, which is the official structure of our economy as it is now, and a pervasive value in our society, and cooperation, and the role and function that it may have, and the possibilities of incorporating increasing amounts of cooperation. And the quotes I'm going to take really were originally introduced to me by a leader emeritus of this society many years ago. Arthur, I believe, gave a talk about the ideas developed by Alfie Cohen. Right. So I just want to use a couple of quotes that to set forth some of the value dimensions here, and then talk about the concrete ways in which efforts are being engaged now to use those things. And these are quotes from Alfie Cohen that I have actually in the footnotes, or actually endnotes of one of my books. Competition works just as any other extrinsic motivator does. The reward for extrinsically motivated behavior is something that is separate from and follows the behavior. With competitive activities, the reward is typically winning, that is, beating the other person or the other team. So the reward is actually extrinsic to the activity itself. And of course, the same is exactly true when the key issue is grades in school. It's the exact same question. But this tells only half the story. The use of extrinsic motivators actually tends to undermine intrinsic motivation and thus adversely affect performance in the long run. This also, I think, is relevant to education. The introduction of, say, monetary reward will edge out intrinsic satisfaction. Once this reward is withdrawn, the activity may well cease, even though no reward at all was necessary for its performance earlier. Extrinsic motivators, in other words, are not only ineffective, but corrosive. They eat away at the kind of motivation that does produce results. Trying to beat another party is extrinsic in nature and tends to decrease people's intrinsic motivation for the target activity. When people are instructed to compete at an activity, they begin to see that activity as an instrument for winning rather than an activity which is rewarding in its own right. Thus, competition seems to work like many other extrinsic rewards, undermining the very quality of one's attention and performance. And then to turn from the quality of the activity to the effect on the quality and the character of the people who participate. And these are tendencies. This is not an all or nothing question, but it's a question of tendencies. All right? Evidence shows that children rated as highly competitive were found to have lower empathy scores than children rated as relatively less competitive. If empathy encourages altruism and competition depresses empathy, then we should find an inverse relationship between competition and altruism, and so we do. The point here is not that competitive individuals never give money to charity, it is rather that competition ultimately discourages generosity. In the words of Karen Horney, competitiveness creates easily aroused envy towards the stronger ones, contempt for the weaker, distrust toward everyone, so the satisfaction and reassurance which one can get out of human relations are limited, and the individual becomes more or less emotionally isolated. Those are tendencies which are worth reflecting upon in a whole range of experiences, and they are, I think, again, tendencies. One should not overstate that. It's not that competition does not produce any significant results. It's not that cooperation is always the most effective way to proceed. But there are tendencies which are pretty well established empirically. So that's something which I think we should all be sensitive to and appreciative of in our own lives. And it relates to things like child rearing, for example, and the effect of trying to play off one child against another. Right? And certainly has profound effects on the question of the value of education. And should put in some interesting light the question of this mania, as it were, for testing, right, and its effect. Right? So having placed that, that's just to give some kind of moral framework, which I think is an expression of some of the more fundamental values of the society of which we are all members. How does that play out, or what's the potential relevance of that from the point of view of the economy? Because we all know how much we emphasize in our society the competitive ethos. Right? So it is to that issue that I want to turn and then discuss some things that are being undertaken locally and locally, statewide, and even nationally. And that's the increasing movement efforts to build cooperative development, building community wealth. And there are numerous dimensions of that, aspects of that, right? Which are now at work, and the Progressive Coalition has undertaken a significant initiative. Our focus has been most primarily on what we call the silver tsunami, something we didn't make up, but it's part of the national movement. That's the baby boomer generation and the number of businesses which are privately owned by baby boomers who are, as it were, aging out of the workforce and who have businesses, right? But they have no succession plan for their businesses, right? What will happen to those businesses? Well, usually they're small, but they could be significantly larger. There are significant numbers of cooperatives in this country which are quite large. And there are cooperatives themselves, I should note, are of vast range of issues. I mean, of different forms. There are producer cooperatives, there are consumer cooperatives, I mean, you may actually be a member of a banking cooperative, right? Credit union. Now, I suspect you're like me, you might be a member of a credit union and haven't once attended a credit union meeting. Right? But in Saskatchewan years ago, a bunch of members of the credit union decided, hey, we should be using this not to simply function as a traditional bank, but we should use it as an essential vehicle for organizing and controlling investment in our community. So they organized and they took over the credit union. And they redirected the ways in which the credit union's investments were taking place. Right? Now, most credit unions don't function that way. Right? And I have never gone to a credit union meeting, and I've been a member of NASA Educators Credit Union for more than 30 years. But the number of people who are members of credit unions, never think of it as a cooperative enterprise, it's about 120 million people in America. That's 1/3 of the American electorate. I mean, American population beyond the American electorate. Right? So there are many elements of that. I mean, you may perhaps have bought Cabot cheese or Gore-Tex. And these are cooperatives, right? But you probably never knew it. Or, even more interesting, actually, from my experience, is you might have bought a book. Okay, you might have bought books by Norton Books, right? Which actually produces a lot of very excellent books. Norton is 100% worker-owned cooperative. Totally worker-owned cooperative. I didn't even know that. I was going to philosophy conventions regularly, and I would go to the bookstores, and I walked around, and I went to Norton Books. I just was talking to the gentleman there, and I asked him about this issue, and he turned around and said, look at the sign. And it says, Holy Worker-Owned Cooperative. And I said, what effect does that have on your situation? He said, well, obviously we can make different choices with respect to the books we produce and print. We're not, what are the differences? One is we are not ruled by the bottom line. Obviously, you have to be effective and viable business, but you can make very different decisions about what you produce. And of course, tremendously different decisions about how you operate in the workplace. Because if you're 100% worker-owned cooperative, that means one person, one vote. You elect the members of the board. You critically evaluate and can replace them. And that has a significant effect on the day-to-day operations of the workplace. Right? Another one is King Arthur Flour, for example. I mean, some people who may cook may know of the quality of King Arthur Flour. I actually I visited their headquarters in, I think it's Nashua, Vermont. It's right across the river from Dartmouth College, where I was going to a weekend seminar. It's a beautiful store, but that is also a 100% worker-owned cooperative. And that was a perfect example of a privately owned business in which the owners decided they no longer wanted to run the business, but they were interested and sensitive enough to work with their employees to turn the business over to the employees, who had to buy it out under certain conditions. Right? So it can be done, and it doesn't mean that a cooperative, sometimes people think, well, it's a cooperative, it means they sit down and argue about everything all the time, and it's a collect. No, an effective cooperative, right, has a structure of management and decision-making, right? The ideal model is the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque region of Spain, which is the world's most significant and successful cooperative model. And the Mondragon cooperatives are something like 80 cooperative businesses with 120,000 workers, and they have their own bank, their own university, and they produce a whole range of businesses, and actually they have overseas business enterprises also. And they were started actually in the 50s during the Franco regime. That's an interesting story in its own right, which will take us too wide a field. But it's a model that is often looked to as to the way in which a cooperative business can operate, right? And that suggests that cooperative business is both economically capable to be economically successful and to have a coherent management structure at the same time in which it is owned and operated by the members, each one of the businesses. As I said, there are 80 different cooperative businesses within the context of the network. And there's an effort in America to replicate things like that in many places around the country. The most specific model is the Evergreen Cooperative Movement in Cleveland, Ohio, which was started by the Democracy Collaborative as part of an effort to replicate, right, the Mondragon model. And that's to work in minority communities with vast amounts of unemployment and to provide jobs and businesses built around the notion of anchor institutions. An anchor institution, like Northwell Health, there it's Chase Western Reserve, it's Cleveland Clinic, they're not going anyplace. They are major institutions in the community, right? But they have a lot of services they need, right? Someone has to do the laundry, right, for the hospital. Right? There are a whole series of services that are required for institutions like that, or here it could be Northwell Health, or the whole medical industry, for example. Right? Those are things you can't really outsource. You can outsource purchasing, but you can also insource purchasing. You can insist or push or demand that a certain percentage of your purchasing is done for your local community. The use of the anchor institution is the center of the Evergreen Cooperatives, and they have several different businesses going on affiliated with that, such as a laundry service, right, which does the laundry for things like Cleveland Clinic, okay? And which hires people who before that were on welfare or unemployed, right, and turns them into worker owners of a cooperative business, which is economically viable and has a really fixed market. They have places to sell, and they can realize a profit. And so there are actually several different businesses that are part of the Evergreen Cooperative. So the separate cooperatives are themselves part of a cooperative consortium, as it were. Right? That's just an example. There are efforts going on around the country to duplicate this kind of model in Pittsburgh, in Richmond, Virginia, in Rochester, New York, which the mayor is interested in trying to duplicate that. So those are happening around the country, Austin, Texas. There are a lot of places in which this is happening. It doesn't get reported in the mainstream media, right? But it happens many places. And a fascinating example of that is happening in our locality, relative locality, is the effort that has been developed around Downstate Hospital in central Brooklyn, which was going to be closed many years ago, right? And the community, that many of these hospitals in minority communities were closed as economically unviable, as the large conglomerate hospitals were taking over everything, and there was an effort to privatize them. And the community organized and said, no, we want to preserve this hospital. Right? They were able to get funding to sustain it for a while, but they realized, we're not going to be able to save this hospital. We got funding for 3 years, but if we continue to do business as usual, the result will be business as usual. It's the old statement, right? If you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, right? Right? So, it's an example of madness, right? So obviously, the committee to save Downstate Hospital became the committee to transform Downstate Hospital. Right? And to see Downstate Hospital as the center, you might say an anchor institution, the center for the transformation of the entire community, Brownsville and East New York, where it's located. Right? And they are, among other things, they've created a business. It's a fascinating business. It's healthy food created by hydroponics. Right? It's an agricultural business in the center of central Brooklyn to provide healthy food for the people in the hospital, among other things. That's just one example. So there's a major organization of community involvement. This, by the way, was led, it's interesting, also relevant to our political consciousness, it was led, the organizing effort was led by the union in the hospital, SCIU, Local 1199. They are at the center of the organizing union organization for the creation of a cooperative enterprise, right, which is not just the hospital, but a series of related and alternative enterprises. And in fact now has been coordinated with a couple of other local hospitals. So it's an entire network that's being developed in central Brooklyn as part of a community revitalization effort. Right? So saying that these efforts are taking place, a lot of things going on around the country related to the effort to try and find cooperative ways for communities to address the failures of the contemporary economic system and to begin within the interstices of the economic system to begin to develop and implement alternative models of economic growth. By the way, we don't have to, I mean, one of the ways to do it is for communities to deal with the problem of these zombie houses that came from the economic collapse of 2008. Right? And one of the ways of responding to that is the creation of land trusts. And land trust is, land trust didn't begin, by the way, with dealing with the zombie houses. Actually, the major land trust operation in the United States began in Burlington, Vermont, under a mayor who's now running for president, the Burlington Land Trust. It now is no longer Burlington Land Trust. I think it's now called Lake Champlain Community Land Trust of some sort. It owns, I think, 1/4 of all the land in the city of Burlington, something to that effect. Right? But a land trust is a situation in which a community, by and large, owns the land, but not necessarily the property on the land. But it's a way in which the property on the land can be maintained affordable for forever, basically. Right? And one of the ways in which local communities have responded, one of the ways, it's a minor way in general, right? But a way of dealing with zombie houses and dealing with community deterioration, the effort to preserve and maintain the community and give community residents an opportunity to control their own affairs, is the creation of land trusts to deal with zombie houses. There is one now functioning in Uniondale, right? At the moment, it's really only, it has a lot, it's linked very closely with the institution you have some people have a connection with, namely Hofstra University, right? And they are dealing, at the moment, trying to successfully transform one house, the last I heard, as part of a land trust operation. But you can begin to have many more houses, and it don't have to be in one location. One way of doing land trust is having one location that you control them, but you can also have many different locations. They don't have to be all residential. The land trust in Burlington, for example, has industrial properties, it has public area properties, it has rental properties, it has ownership properties, where individuals own the houses, but not the land on which the house sits, and therefore they own it under some deed restrictions as to who they can sell it to under what conditions. So you have a land trust in Uniondale, which is operating, and if Sylvia were here, she could talk about the efforts now underway, of which she is, I think, president or vice president of the Hempstead Land Trust.
Yes.
Right? I'm not sure which is it.
It's the Hempstead.
Yeah, but she's president of...
Secretary.
She's a secretary, okay. She's a secretary. Now, they don't have at the moment any houses, but they have political officials who are quite committed and enthusiastic about giving houses to the Hempstead town, it's a village, I think it's called Hempstead Village Land Trust, to begin to preserve, transform those houses, but maintain them affordable in perpetuity, as opposed to, producing houses. The fascinating thing, for example, which I was astounded to hear recently, is that Habitat for Humanity, which you've all heard of, right, would go around the world, get volunteers, and go and revise and fix up houses. And then they would turn them over to private individuals who were in desperate need. But once the individuals got them, it was like making an economic killing. Individuals owned the house, and if they wanted to do it several years, they could sell the house, and it was worth 2, 3, 4 times what they paid for it. And there's no way you can deal with affordability in that way. Well, I was astounded to find out that Habitat for Humanity in New York City recognized that's a disastrous program That does not address the problem of affordable housing. And they transformed themselves. They, in cooperation with several other organizations, created a New York City-wide land trust. They only do land trust houses in New York City now, Habitat for Humanity. I thought that was exciting. That was brilliant. Right? So you probably heard about that in the press. I've never seen anything written about it. But I happened to be at a meeting in which the members of Habitat for Humanity were talking about the transformation of their conception. Right? So there are opportunities. I mean, I don't want to suggest that it is simple or easy. There are a lot of technical problems. You can talk with the people at Uniondale, or Sylvia, I'm sure she's going to encounter them. In Hempstead, there are all kinds of technical problems in having houses transferred, getting control, ownership, and working out the details beyond my pay grade, as they say. So, but it's doable, and it's doable beyond 1 or 2 houses. It's doable. It can be done to scale, as it were. It can be major initiatives in which communities basically take democratic control of their own planning. Because when you have a land trust, right, it is the members of the land trust who have democratic control. It takes the houses out of the so-called free market in real estate. And the free market in real estate, a lot you can say about it for good and for bad, but one thing you know, right, is as places get more attractive, the rents get driven up, and the people who are there are driven out. Right? And I don't want to comment, and I don't have a final interpretation of the situation with respect to Amazon. Right? But you can be sure that if Amazon had moved into Long Island City, that would have involved a radical transformation of the entire community, and it would have certainly driven up housing costs fantastically. And for those who had the money and could afford it, that would have been fine. And for those who did not have the money, they would have been simply driven out, as is the normal case. That's one of the great economic roles of the art community in our world, you know. Art communities, as well as more so than even than political organizing groups, move into dilapidated areas because the rents are cheap. Like used to happen in Soho, right? If you remember back in those years, right? You would go to Soho. That's where you would go if you wanted to you wanted cheap rent for your theater and your plays, etc. And I can remember, I don't know how many years now. Do you remember how many years, Al, that we went to see Spalding Gray? 35 years when I was teaching at the new school, and he would come to my classes, and he had started the Performing Garage in Soho. And you wouldn't want to go to Soho to see a play then. It was a little scary and dangerous, right? But because the rents were cheap, right? Well, after a while, more and more artists were there, and it became more and more fascinating and exciting place to be. And as it did, in came the Gap and other, major corporations, and the rents went up, and the price, and the people were driven out, and the artists headed for a different place. And that's the continual dynamic of the dynamism, you might say, of the free market. It has its virtues, and it has its consequences. But you create a land trust, you gain control of that capacity to determine planning. So that's happening around the country. But locally, there are these small efforts at land trusts. Most people don't understand them. So it's very difficult to understand, market them, and banks may be unwilling to lend money, etc. But that's just one example. The example I was talking about with respect to Mondragon and the Evergreen Cooperatives is another example of trying to create a community-based organization similar to the Land Trust, right, which provides productive jobs. And the example with Downstate Hospital in Brooklyn and the creation of the coalition to transform, what is now called the Coalition to Transform Downstate Hospital, is the center of a community revitalization project, which is an effort at cooperative community development. What the Progressive Coalition has been doing, more specifically we have targeted, we've been pushing a series of other initiatives, such as the creation of a state bank. There are major efforts to create a municipal bank in New York City, and there are preliminary efforts to try and create a state bank in the state. Obviously something that is politically, as they would say, a heavy lift, with tremendous opposition clearly coming from some of the most wealthy players in the world, like Chase and Citibank and etc. You can imagine, right? But what's the virtues of a state bank? Well, just think for a moment. You pay your taxes, and it goes to the state, and where does it go? The state has to put it away in a bank, right? So it can draw it and use it. Well, what does it do? It puts it in Chase or Citibank, etc. And what do they get all the interest, vast amounts of interest. Their shareholders get a tremendous amount of profits, right? Their officers get high salaries. You don't want to know how high they are. And then they invest them wherever they want around the world, right? But if it's a state bank, and there is one good example, North Dakota, right? You find that the North Dakota officers, for example, their salaries in the $200,000 range. About 1/20th of what Jamie Dimon at the Citibank gets, right? And what do they do with the money? Well, where do the profits go? They go back to North Dakota. The state gets the profits. And what do they do with the investments? They facilitate the local banks to invest in the local community. North Dakota was the only place during the collapse of 2008 in which they suffered no economic hardship, their banks, because their banks didn't engage in that speculative fervor, which led to destruction. So there's an effort to get a state bank going. It's a major organizing thing. Okay, I will wrap up shortly. I could go on for this, as you can imagine, a great one, but I won't. Rest assured. But let me go back to two more points, and then I will bring to a conclusion these exciting remarks. Right. One thing they're doing in New York City and around the world, and it actually started in Puerto Alegre in Brazil, they have participatory budgeting. In New York City, right, every council person can choose to participate in a participatory budgeting process where a certain amount of money is allocated to each councilman and district. And the community, in a carefully determined program, determines specifically, not recommends how to spend the money, but determines how to spend the money. It's a relatively small amount at the moment, right? I don't exactly know the amount. But the community gets together, and there's a series of meetings, there is a process they go through, and they have a certain amount of money that's available, and people make proposals with respect to what they would like to see done, and architects and engineers go in and evaluate how this would be done and what the cost would be, and then the people vote at a meeting as to which are the priorities and how the money will get spent. And that takes place now in the city of New York. It's not only in New York City, New York. It began originally in Puerto Alegre, Brazil, many years ago. And there are many places around this country and elsewhere in the world in which participatory budgeting takes place. It could be done in any local school district, to whole or in part. But what we're doing, this is where I'll conclude on this note, what the LIPC is doing is addressing one specific aspect of this, and we're prioritizing. Right? We're prioritizing addressing the silver tsunami and addressing the problem of millennial business owners who do not have a succession plan. We've been funded by that. We've been receiving money from the Babylon IDA, probably the first time in the history of this country that an industrial development agency has given money to a non-profit organization to promote worker cooperatives. We also, I believe, I shouldn't speak out of thing, but I believe we've gotten money from the Nassau and Suffolk IDAs also. Thank Richard Kessel, to advance that. And we've also been funded by Bethpage Credit Union and by Community Foundation just for this project. The project is to locate businesses that are in that position, to talk with the owners, to find out if they are interested and worth considering it. There are tax benefits to the owners. And then if the owners are interested, and we can explore with that, then we need to look at the business, make sure it's economically viable. We have groups that will do the evaluation for that. Right? If we can evaluate how much the business will cost, what would be the price, what would be the process of buying it out. And if all that works out, then to talk with the workers, see if they want to do it, and what kind of support they will need, and what kind of training. right, to try and facilitate that process. Right? That's simply a part of a national process. It's happening all over the country. There are numerous organizations involved. We're just trying to bring it to bear and all around. And people who want to find out more about some of these things specifically, you are more than welcome to come to a public forum we will be doing on Friday morning, June 7th, at the office of the Long Island Federation of Labor in Howell Park from 9 to 11. Everybody's welcome to come. That's part of a process to try and begin to bring the cooperative economy and the democratic control within the interstices of America's capitalist economy to mitigate and to address some of the inadequacies and failures. The long-term future of this remains unclear. It is not all that, of course, that we do politically. It is not, but it is a central element of trying and address some of the fundamental inadequacies of our society and bringing the values of the ethical movement into the public sphere. Thank you.